So if I'm going to be really transparent, I have worked on this particular podcast for entirely too long because for something that I want to feel very natural, just very fluid, I have so severely over-prepared. And I still don't think that I'm actually prepared. So I'm just going to let it rip because this topic means something really deep to me that I'm having a difficult time putting it into words. So I'm just going to have to let it go. I'm just going to have to let it all out and see what falls into this recording. Poetry has been something that has been really integral to my journal process for a very long time. And it wasn't until recently that I actually started to step out and share some of that poetry with the world. It was always something that was very much just for me. And I can remember the first time I actually shared a poem. It was a haiku that I had written for my sister's salon. And I think this was way back, maybe in the mid 2000s, I'm thinking. But ever since then, like I said, this is something that has resided deep within my journaling process until the last few years that I finally decided it was time to start sharing this aspect of myself with others. I think the reason that I was so afraid to share with people is because poetry is quite literally exposing something so deep within us. The poetic words that fall into my journal each night, they say something so much deeper than I can share with you through this type of conversation where I'm just speaking. And I think that that's why this particular podcast has been so difficult to try to wrap my head around, because I don't know where the podcast begins and the poetic begins. So welcome to episode 15 of the Out of Step podcast. This is going to be a solo episode if you haven't guessed already. And really what set this particular session in motion was a few weeks ago. My beautiful wife, who is incredibly observant, asked me how I was doing, because she could tell that something was different. Not necessarily good, bad, right, or wrong, but she could feel that something was different for me. And the words that came out of my mouth were, life feels more like a poem lately and less like a documentary. And ever since I shared that and embraced that fully, I have felt that life is just moving in a very different way. My interaction with how life is moving is happening in a very, very different way. And it started to build out this concept for me of living life and seeing life more through the lens of poetry versus the lens of documentary. I personally have really struggled with this because I like facts. I like information. I like the metrics that I can gather about something so I can make a really logical formulation around it. And poetry does not do that. So it's been a huge journey for me. And I do feel that that is the best way that I can explain the shift that has been happening for me really over the past few years. And I don't know if you've ever heard that saying, that things happen slowly and then they happen suddenly. But that's exactly what this is feeling like. And a huge part of this is, I think, starting to share my poetry more openly. I think it's that I'm reading a lot more poetry by other authors, and even the mythology course, the Celtic mythology course that I've been going through. Mythology is written in such a poetic way that you can't just take it at surface value. You really have to dive deeper and look under the covers of the individual words and the characters, not just as things that we should take for face value, but the archetypes that they potentially represent, or the metaphorical lesson that's hiding beneath that story. So while I think that this has been brewing for many, many, many years, maybe since I was quite young, something definitely has shifted more suddenly in the past handful of months. And I'm trying to find ways to share that with others in hopes that perhaps we can all stop looking at the world so linearly and mathematically and start to see it more poetically. And because this is the Out of Step podcast, and specifically creating this content for those of you who do live in this world of supporting other humans, part of what I hope I can do in our time together is also start to shape how we can utilize this different lens of poetry to guide even how we interact and how we work with the people who sit across from us and ask for our support. I have tended to live a lot of my life in a very future-paced mindset. I'm always looking to the future to see what's coming next and what I can plan for, how I can sculpt my entire experience to be what I want it to be in the future. Which, the thing that I have not been great at then is being present within this moment. And I think this is one of the things that the poets have always been incredible at. There is nothing that is missed within the moment. In fact, they're so good at giving a very grand framework to things that may actually seem quite mundane. They don't just sit within a moment. They really explore it. They peel it open. They are tuning into every sense of sight and sound and feeling, and even reaching into that liminal space to understand what's happening spiritually. And then they can translate that into these incredible verses that allow us to feel, see, hear, and experience much of what they were in that moment. And again, not through literal descriptions, but by something that, even if we don't understand it cerebrally, tends to bring us into that space. And just as an example, here's a poem called At Home. This is by David Whyte in his book, The House of Belonging. At home amidst the bees wandering the garden in the summer light, the sky a broad roof for the house of contentment where I wish to live forever in the eternity of my own fleeting and momentary happiness. I walk toward the kitchen door as if walking toward the door of a recognized heaven, and see the simplicity of shelves and the blue dishes and the vaporing steam rising from the kettle that called me in. Not just this aromatic cup from which to drink, but the flavor of a life made whole and lovely through the imagination seeking its way. Not just this house around me, but the arms of a fierce but healing world. Not just this line I write, but the innocence of an earned forgiveness flowing again through hands made new with writing. And a man with no company but his house, his garden, and his own well-peopled solitude, entering the silences and chambers of the heart to start again. I think this is a really perfect example of what I'm trying to share here, which is, through the lens of poetry, something that could be considered fairly mundane, which is just walking into the house, becomes something quite grand. And I think often we miss these subtle moments that have such a gift, like David Whyte showed us in the poem, because we're looking for the blockbuster moment. We have become so accustomed to just seeing the roof over our head or the tea kettle on the counter that we pass by it and we don't take notice of what that could bring into our awareness. Instead, our senses and our mind have become so tuned into these really intense moments that that's usually all that registers for us. And I mean, that could be an intense moment of joy, it could be an intense moment of sadness, but all of those things in between, that maybe gray space, as we might call it, just becomes subconscious chatter. Another element of the poetic that I think is exceptionally important for those of us who do work with other humans is the attentiveness and the welcoming of all aspects of experience. So all emotion has place within a poem. In fact, it doesn't just have place, it's often celebrated. So even something like boredom could be celebrated within a poem. The sadness of a moment is just as recognized and celebrated as the happiness and the reward of the moment. And I think what this really offers us as the coach, the guide, the facilitator, whatever you call yourself, is I feel it gives us a more transparent way of reflecting to others. Because if all emotion, all experience has value and a place in the story, then we no longer have to reflect back in any way to move them perhaps away from what we might perceive as uncomfortable or quote negative emotions or energies. In fact, we can sit with them and recognize that the sadness or the anger or the frustration or perhaps even the apathy all have medicine within them. They all have potency. And so we don't have to fear them or try to fix or try to move through them. We can include that in the poetic movement of whatever the experience is happening for them, just as much as if they're sharing something really exciting that they find a lot of joy or find a lot of passion, find a lot of pleasure in. Those all have equal place as well. But again, we don't have to put weight onto that side of the scale. In my own work as a wayfaring guide, two really key elements are an aspect of what we might refer to as parts work and also multiple intelligence integration. So really seeing all of the different parts of the human being and also the different elements of intelligence within the full scale of the person. And again, this is part of what I see in poetry versus maybe like a documentary type of mentality. The documentary mentality, I think, can take that path of, well, here are the facts, here are the information, here's kind of the big picture definition of who this person is and what they are. And let me just side note this. I'm not saying that all documentaries are that way. Hear it for what it is. It's my perspective on that concept of a documentary. I don't want you coming at me saying, well, what about this documentary? This one's so good and it does show this detail. So again, hear it for what it is, my own interpretation. But in the poetic, we actually see these intricacies under the surface, almost as individual aspects of that being. So if I think of the poets that were very introspective, did a lot of self-reflection, very often they're using new names for themselves to describe aspects or parts, and really describing things from a sense of the heart says this, or the gut says this, or my skin expressing whatever it might be. And so in that very poetic nature, it almost dissects the human into the many different parts that accumulate and become that single thing that we call me. And this is, again, a big part of, I know for me, it's a big part of my work, which is allowing people to peel back those layers, to recognize that when they say, well, I feel really angry, but I also feel really guilty that I feel that sense of anger. we can peel back the layer of the shell that they're saying is me, and now we can see the poetic nature of, wow, there's all of these different, almost individual beings living within what I call me. I do have a version of me, a part of me, an aspect of me that feels incredibly angry right now. I also have a part of me that shows up and says, hey, this is not aligned with maybe higher self. And we can recognize that these two parts both have a valued perspective that we can hold. They can both be true at the same time. And again, I think that's what the poets all did incredibly well, is it wasn't about the inner fight for something to overcome the other. It was really about honoring the fact that all parts of us had a place in the story. All parts of us had a place in the poem. And I think this approach allows us to see more of the nuance. It allows us to see some of the subtle layers that could be missed if we were looking for, again, these kind of blockbuster hit moments. In my Wayfaring method training, where I'm training people to do the work that I do as coaches and guides, one of the things that I often say is don't get caught on the gem. Because often as we're listening to the person sitting across from us, they're sharing lots and lots of things that upon first inspection might seem a bit surface, might seem a bit flat. Yet if we just did what Judith Glaser says, which is double click on something, if you think about being on a computer and you double click, it opens it up further. If we just double click on something, perhaps ask what the heart is understanding about this, asking what they're sensing within the nervous system as they say those words, we can start to get information at more subtle levels. And I think about this in the way that, there is a haiku poet, a Japanese woman, her name's Chiyo Ni, and she can create such depth with just a few lines. One of my favorites is this one called At the Crescent Moon. It says, at the crescent moon, the silence enters the heart. Let me read that for you one more time. At the crescent moon, the silence enters the heart. And if we sit with that and let it soak, and we maybe double click on it a bit and say, what is that for me? What does that raise within me? Then we'll start to find some real beauty in the subtlety, as compared to maybe like the epics of Shakespeare or Homer, where every detail is really just built out and there's nothing subtle. Everything is very deeply explored and expressed. Neither one has more or less power to it. And each one has a really unique gift to offer us. I feel like I could go on and on and on, to be honest with you. And at the same time, I feel that I've made my point. And I could offer you more poetry and more little bits and pieces of what I'm trying to bring across here. But perhaps, like a great poem, that would actually start to water down the message. So I think I'm going to wrap it up here with just the recognition that while the facts, the figures, the measurements, the specific SMART goals, all of the things that many of us have been trained on within the coaching world do absolutely have a place, that's not the living of life. That is the framing that we can put life within to try to make sense of it or to try to give it order or direction. But that's not really life itself. That's where I feel like we get to reach for the poetic. I want to read you one last thing to leave you with, and this is from a great teacher of mine named Frank Owen, and this is in his book, The Mist-Filled Path. My wish for you is a homecoming in this life, a coming in out of the cold, a drying off the icy rain's touch. In the holy reliquary of childhood memory, may you find there the unshakable truth of your preciousness. May you remember the cool and padded graces of your wet feet against stone. In the middle of a long night, a single burning light serving as your peace. May you fold back the pocket holding your slights, your jilted times, your feelings of betrayal, and discover small diamonds there, created from the crushed coal of your hates and rage. May you taste resurrection without the need of dying for it.